Hi, guys. Welcome back. I am pretty excited to read this book to you guys today. Do you remember I went to the National Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio last week, and I learned a lot of cool things about people who helped those get free who were escaping slavery. And they were known as conductors. And they oftentimes, homes would have a lantern sitting in their window to know that they were a safe place to go to. And so in the museum, they have a little light burning on the third floor, a little torch burning all the time, and pretty cool experience. So I have heard about, and in the museum, they even had some giant quilts made by a great artist that symbolize these freedom quilts. But I'd heard about the freedom quilts. And let's read this one now so we can understand more. This one is called Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quilt. And these quilts were secret maps to help people find freedom and to get to the Ohio River, where they would cross over into the North Territory where it would be free, and then head north towards Canada. And the Underground Railroad helped people get through to Canada. So once they had escaped, oftentimes there were still people looking for them. So they still had to hide. Before I was even 12 years old, I got sent north from North Farm to Home Plantation because they needed another field hand. When I got there, I cried so much they thought I was never going to eat or drink again. I didn't want to leave my mama. I'm going back to her, I whispered every day to young Jack, who worked beside me in the fields. Well, you better start eating. All you can, sweet Clara, he smiled at me. But then his smile was gone. In a low voice, he said, or else you won't make it. Young Jack helped me believe I'd get back to my mama some day. Truth was, I'd be lost before I got through the fields, them being so big and all, but I didn't give up my dreamin'. Aunt Rachel was raising me now. She wasn't my for real blood aunt, but she did her best to care for me. One night she came back from working in the big house and found me lying dead tired on the cabin floor. She shook her head and say, Sweet Clara, you ain't gonna last in a field, but I got an idea. Aunt Rachel's idea was sewing. She started teaching me the very next night. It wasn't easy for me to learn, my hands already rough and clumsy from hoeing and weeding the fields, so Aunt Rachel took it real slow. She brought scraps of cloth from the big house and taught me about each one, how it was special and had to be treated in its own way. I liked to piece the scraps together to make pretty patterns of color, but Aunt Rachel didn't care much about pretty patterns. Now you rip out those whole row and do it again, Clara, she say. Why I gotta make the stitches so tiny, I complained. You gonna be a real seamstress, that's why. Tomorrow you comin' with me to the big house. I got it all worked out, Aunt Rachel say one day. I was frightened. You ready to sew with me? She went on. Mrs. daughter Ella, she be getting married in the spring. I told Mrs. I'd be needing help. She look at you with a sharp eye, Clara. So do it quick and neat like I taught you. Next morning I tried to eat some cornbread, but my insides was all knotted up. I never been inside the big house before or seen the white people that close, except overseer. The morning sun was streaming into the sewing room, turning everything all yellow like sunflower yellow. Aunt Rachel give me some sheets to hem. Instead of being contrary, that needle did all I wanted, just like it was part of my hand. At the end of the day, Mrs. come in. Let me see your work, Clara, she say. I give her the sheet, and she ran it through her hands real slow. I held my breath watchin'. From now on, come here, she say at last. When she left, Aunt Rachel and I look at each other, about ready to burst. We done it, girl, she cried. So I changed from a field hand to a seamstress. Since the sewing room was right off the kitchen, Aunt Rachel and I were near cook and the helpers. There was always a lot of bustle and company in the kitchen. I was hearing about all kinds of new places and things. I listened so hard, it felt like my ears must be growing right out of my head and getting big with listening. One day, two white men come to see the master. The drivers went into the kitchen to talk to cook. They had been too many runaways last summer, one of the drivers said. They're going around asking all the masters in the country to join their patrollers. Crazy running away, muttered cook as she beat up some batter. Where are you going to get to cut? Where are you going to get to except for a lost in the swamp? Dunno, said the driver, but I hear we ain't that far from the Ohio River. Once you get that far, the Underground Railroad will carry you across. That's right, agreed the first. The railroad will get you all the way to Canada. Then you free forever. Cook snorted. If it be as easy as you two let on, more would it gone. One of the men replied in a quiet voice, It'd be easy if you could get a map. Walking back from the big house that evening, I asked Aunt Rachel about what I'd heard. Where's Canada? And what's the Underground Railroad? See there, Aunt Rachel pointed. That's the North Star. Under that star, far up north, is Canada. The Underground Railroad is people who've been helping folks get there, secret like. She looked at me hard. But don't you start thinking about it. You run away and get caught, you'll be beaten. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Next day, I asked Cook, those two men that was here yesterday, they was talking about a map. What's a map? It's just a picture of the land, that's all. Whatever's on the ground, a map can have it. Sunday, I went to my favorite place on the little hill and looked out at the people's cabins and the fields. I took a stick and I started making a picture in the dirt of all I could see. But how could I make a picture of things far away that I couldn't see? And how could I make a map that would be washed away by by the rain? A map that would show the way to freedom. Then one day I was sewing a patch on a pretty blue blanket. The patch looked just the same as the cow pond near the cabins. The little stitches looked like a path going all the way around it. Here it was, a picture that wouldn't wash away, a map. So I start the quilt. When you sewin', no matter how careful you be, little scraps of cloth always be left after you cut out a dress or a pillowcase. So while my ears kept listening and my hands kept sewing, I began to squirrel away these little bits of cloth. When we was off work, I went to visit people in the quarters. I started asking what fields there were. Then I started piecing the scraps of cloth with the scraps of things I was learning. Aunt Rachel say, Sweet Clara, what kind of pattern you making in that quilt? Ain't no pattern I ever seen. I don't know, Aunt Rachel. I'm just patching it together as I go. She looked at me long, but she just nodded. There was a buzzing in the quarters one summer evening. I saw the patrollers and I knew someone had run away. It was young Jack. But 5 days later they caught him. The next Sunday I went to see him and we walked to the top of the hill. He didn't smile the way he used to. I took a stick and began to draw in the dirt. I drew a little square for the big house, a line of boxes for the cabins or the quarters, and some bigger squares for the fields east of the big house. I drew as much as I pieced together. Jack sat beside me, not saying anything, not even looking at first. Then he started seeing what I was doing. I handed the stick to him. I hear him catch his breath up quick. Then he began to draw. I worked on the quilt for a long time. Sometimes months would go by and I wouldn't get any pieces sewn on it. Sometimes I had to wait to get the right kind of cloth. I had blue calico and flowered blue silk for creeks and rivers, and green and green for the fields, and white sheets for the roads. Missus liked to wear pink a lot, so the big house, the quarters, and finally the big house of the North Farm, they was all pink. The quilt got bigger and bigger, and if folks knew what I was doing, no one said, but they came by the sewing room to pass the time of day whenever they could. By the way, Clara, a driver might tell me, I heard the master saying yesterday he didn't want to travel to Mr. Morris's place, 'cause it's over 20 miles north of here. Or someone would sit eating cook's food and say, so as long as I could hear, word is they're going to plant corn in these west fields on the Verona plantation this year. When the master went out hunting, Cook's husband was the guide. He came back and say, that swamp next to the plantation, it's a nasty place. But listen up, Clara, and I'll tell you how I thread my way in and out of there as smooth as your needle through your cloth. Then one night the quilt was done. I looked at it spread out in the dim light of the cabin. Aunt Rachel studied it for a longest time. She touched the stitches lightly, her fingers moving slowly over the last piece. I'd added a hidden boat that would carry us across the Ohio River. Finally, they came to rest on the bright star at the top. She tried to make her voice cheery. You always did like to make patterns and pictures, Clara. You get yourself married to young Jack one of these days, and you two will have a real nice quilt to sleep under. Aunt Rachel, I couldn't sleep under this quilt, I answered softly, putting my hand over hers. Wouldn't be restful, somehow. Anyway, I think it should stay here. Maybe others can use it. Aunt Rachel sighed. But ain't you gonna need a quilt where you going? I kissed her. Don't worry, Aunt Rachel. I got the memory of it in my head. It rained for 3 days the next week. Me and Jack left Home Plantation in the dark thunderstorm. The day after, it was too stormy to work in the field, so Jack wasn't missed, and Aunt Rachel told them I was sick. We went north, following the trail of the Freedom Quilt. All the things people told me about. All the tiny stitches I took now, I could see real things. There was the old tree struck down by lightning, and the winding road near the creek, and the hunting path through the swamp. It was like being in a dream you already dreamed. There's the path through the swamp. Mostly, we hid during the day and walked at night. We got to North Farm. Jack slipped in through the darkness to find what cabin my mom was at. Then we went in to get her and found a little sister I didn't even know I had. Mama was so surprised. Sweet Clara, you've grown so big. Her eyes just like I remembered, her arms strong around me. Mama, I'm here for you. We're going north. We know the way. I was afraid she wouldn't come, but then Mama say yes. Young Jack carried my sister Anna, and I held on to Mama's hand. We kept on as fast as we could, skirting farms and towns and making our way through the woods. At last, one clear, dark night, we came to the Ohio River. The river was high, but I remember the place on the quilt where I'd marked the crossing. We searched the brush along the banks until the last we found the little boat. This was hidden here by folks in the Underground Railroad, I said. The boat carried us across the dark, deep water to the other side. Shivering and hungry and scared, we stood looking ahead. Which way now? Jack asked me. I pointed. The North Star was shining clear above us. Up there, through the woods, up north to Canada. Sometimes I think back to the night we left. When young Jack came to wake me, I can still see Aunt Rachel sitting up in her bed. She just shook her head before I could say a word. Before you go, just cover me with your quilt, sweet Clara, she'd say. I'm too old to walk, but not too old to dream, and maybe I can help others follow the quilt to freedom. Aunt Rachel kept her word. The quilt is there still, at Home Plantation. People go look at it, even folks from neighboring farms. I know because some of them come and tell me how they used it to get free. But not all as lucky as we were. and most never can come. Sometimes I wish I could sew a quilt that would spread over the whole land, and people just follow the stitches to freedom, as easy as taking a Sunday walk. Composite and see if you can find some of the things she added. I see a few plantations, the different crops of corn. The white is the road, blue is water. I see the big Ohio and the boat and the North Star and a church, and pretty amazing.